So is it not projected that they can't see?
Pardon me?
I don't see it on the screen, so they're not able to see what I'm...
No, they will see it. When you started, ganz kurze Frage, wo ist das Team? Wenn Aïda die startet, dann wird das, okay, when you start, the screen will be shared for the people who are online.
What about them?
They see it here.
Okay.
Ja? Okay, sagt ihr, wenn wir anfangen können? Okay. Okay, so welcome to our third day of Hamburg Portfolio Review today. We are very pleased to have Aïda Muluneh here today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And Aïda is a CANON ambassador, Ethiopian artist, role model, photographer, and yeah, we are very, very happy to have you here and looking forward to your show. And afterwards, we will have some time for questions. So thank you very much. You have your microphone there.
Okay. So I can start? So thank you everybody for being here today. I'm very happy to be here in Hamburg for the Hamburg Portfolio Review. I've had a very intense schedule of traveling, and through that travel, this is a presentation that I've given in the past, and after spending some time in different countries in Europe, I think, you know, this is really a presentation for the young photographers. I spent some time reviewing photographers from the CANON student program. And the key thing for me is just to give you an oversight of how I started. I think often people think that I'm only a fine art photographer, but I actually started in photojournalism. And what I teach in Africa is really based on, you know, the foundation of creating a narrative comes through, you know, how we tell a story through a collection of images. So my story actually began when I went back to Ethiopia the first time, and you know, having grown up abroad and spending so much time, you know, really contemplating on the image of my country, you know, often in the media, when we talk about Ethiopia, when we see the visual, what comes out of Ethiopia, it always been a one-sided story. So my entry into photography first was really to advocate for my country and to show the complexities of where I come from, that it's not just, you know, one type of image, but there's a lot of stories within Ethiopia. And through that, I've had really great mentors who have really guided me through my career. And the key thing that I've understood has been, you know, how do I portray my people? How do I tell stories? And really, how do I share with the world, you know, what is the image of Ethiopia and Africa? So in my first return to Ethiopia in 2002, I spent a few months there. And, you know, having left Ethiopia at the age of 5, it was a way for me to sort of learn about my people again. So since I don't have any family album of my existence within Addis Ababa, it was a way for me to also really be able to capture a memory of Ethiopia that, in a sense, I'm creating my own memories within it. And in the beginning, you know, I'm a photographer who started in analog. So for example, these images is, you know, images that I have taken with, you know, film. And the key thing to me has always been, you know, how do I capture moments? How do I capture sort of a different slice of, you know, the daily life within Addis Ababa? And at this time, I was working at the Washington Post, so I came back with 40 rolls of film. And basically, you know, the big challenge for, you know, when you're a young photographer is how do you edit your work? So my whole mission has been really, you know, how do I navigate in the market? And then how do I maintain, and this is something that I've said to all the young photographers, you know, how do you maintain an authentic voice within your own work? And how do you stay true to what is your mission and what is your objective? Because often I think the industry and, you know, these different portals try to make photographers navigate into an existence that is not true to themselves. So shooting in black and white, you know, my first passion is that, and I've always gravitated towards it. So it was really a way for me to just focus on, you know, the different layers within an image and not to have the distraction of color. So sometimes, you know, some editors will say, well, there's too many black and white photos, or, you know, how come there's no color? But this is what I felt passionate about. And it wasn't until I met Chester Higgins, who used to be a photographer, staff photographer at New York Times, and he had a book that really had a big impact on me that I realized, okay, shooting in black and white is not a crime, you know, it's sort of my visual language and my visual approach. So after that, I came back to Ethiopia in 2007, and it was really a way again to reconnect. And the key thing for me was I spent about 2 months on the road traveling, you know, around Ethiopia, and to have a better understanding of who my people are, and also again, how do I represent, you know, who we are, you know, as a community, who we are as a culture. And for that, it was also this transition of going, you know, shooting in my country now from an analog into a digital existence. And I know when digital first came about, you know, it was a very challenging thing to shift your mindset, because when you have a roll of film in your camera, how you process your mind and how you process the image is very different from this digital existence. And again, went back to black and white, and then basically, you know, came back into color. And through these different interactions that I've had, you know, the one thing that I've always taught is that you have to build a connection with the people that you are photographing. So for example, in this image, you know, we walked into a small cafe in the middle of nowhere, and, you know, they knew I had a camera. I waited, and one of the, I think the big thing for photographers is how do we become invisible in a space, and how do we capture the natural moments of whomever that we're trying to portray. But through it, color has always been a big challenge for me. And I don't know, I see things in black and white still. So for me, it's really, you know, moving towards color photography has always, you know, unless it's screaming color, I don't see it. So I realized that a lot of my work, for my journalistic work, was just being attracted by specific colors that just kept appearing. And it was really much later on that I realized that all these experiences that I had in journalism really had an impact within the fine art realm. So when we talk about a visual narrative, and I know currently in the industry, there's a big conversation about what is photography. You know, there's a big conversation about the validity of photography as it relates to, you know, photojournalism or fine art. And my approach has been is that I don't believe in the elitism of photography. I believe that if you can effectively communicate what is in your heart, and if you can effectively communicate what is important to you, you can still say the same things, you know, and the same messages that you can transmit. So when I started this journey, it was actually through Simone Jami, who is a curator based out of Paris, Cameroonian background. And he commissioned different artists from across Africa to have an interpretation on Dante's Divine Comedies. And at that time, I was trying to figure out, you know, should I go back into my black and white journalism to express this old, you know, text, or should I, you know, basically try to find a new form of expressing myself? And this was really the beginning for me. And I made 7 pieces for this work. And it was a way for me to express, because my section was Inferno. So when you look at the Divine Comedies, it's, you know, you have Paradise, Purgatory, and Inferno. So I wanted to show what was Inferno to me. And through that, it was really a big challenge on making a body of work that really expressed what was within me. And the one thing that I realized is that I drew a lot of inspiration from all the work I was doing across Ethiopia. You know, I was doing assignments for the UN. You know, I was seeing the different challenges of my community. But I came to a point where I knew photojournalism was just not enough to express what I wanted to say. So I decided, okay, let me go into this form. And I think for a lot of young photographers, I think often there's always a danger of sort of jumping into finding style before you actually go through the process of understanding, you know, how do you construct a set of images. So for me, this is why photojournalism was quite important, because that helped me transition into the fine art, and it sort of added layers for me as it relates to what is that I'm trying to say within it. So I've always believed that, you know, when we talk about a visual narrative and, you know, transmitting a message, you know, I've said often, I'm not here to offer answers for Africa. I'm here to really ask questions. So for example, for this piece, this was a dedication to the football player Danny Alves. And I don't know if you've ever seen, he was coming out to the football field and they threw a banana at him and he picked it up and ate it. And I thought this was such a fascinating way to process racism in Europe. And within that, then I started thinking how when you really look at sort of how certain symbols and certain fruits have been attached to racism, to me, it's still, in this day and age, we're still having this conversation. So through, these different collections that I have built over the years, again, every frame that I create, everything that is in the image is really a reflection of what I've experienced, the things that I've encountered, or the questions that I'm raising as it relates to myself as an African, as a diaspora, as a female. All these components exist. And also there is a political history to sort of my movements globally, because I've traveled a lot in my lifetime. And again, it's a question of sort of raising certain issues. And for me, it was never it was never having a conversation about identity, but it was really having a conversation about some of the challenges that we face in the continent. So, for example, this image, which is titled "The Return of a Departure," this was really looking at, a lot of the Africans that are dying in the ocean, trying to cross over into Europe. And this kind of reminded me about the slave trade, of the number of Africans that died really trying to, being taken from West Africa into the Americas. So again, it's always adding layers to the work, but at the same time, the work that I do, there's a lot of symbolism. And I always say, the work that I create is really for my people first, so that they have sort of a sense of the conversation I'm having. And then the rest for the international audience is to have sort of an insight of just the complexities of the different visual languaging that exists within Africa. And in that sense, it wasn't just only looking at, having conversations only in Africa, because I believe that when we look at the global South, we share similar issues. There's a lot, there's a lot of things that connects us. And even when you look at the development of photography in the global South, we do share a commonality as it relates to what are we able to document in our countries, what are we able to express through photography. So right now, when you look at sort of the rise of photography coming out of Africa, there's a lot of fine art photography, because we have challenges of trying to capture the reality on the ground. And for that, we resort into other forms in order for us to be able to tell the same story that any journalist would say about our country. And through that, for me, I realized that the tool of photography is really, how do we advocate for something very specific? So currently, for example, there's a show at the Tate that I'm a part of called A World in Common, and it kind of gives you the spectrum of photography from across the continent, and it gives you a spectrum of the different, not only interpretations, but the different approach of how we're using photography to disseminate specific information to the global market that is not based on the cliche images that we always see as it relates to Africa. And this is why, I think today and in this time period, as opposed to when I started, now there's actually more photographers from the continent, because editors understand that, to try to get the authentic story, you need to find the photographers on the ground. And many of us are really working in Africa to teach. I run a festival, we do different portfolio reviews, because we need also our own storyteller. So it's a very ironic situation for me when, the reality of one country is only documented through the foreign gaze. It's the same thing as, for example, Germany is only photographed by Ethiopian photographers. That sounds ironic when we think about it, in the other way around. So in that sense, it's quite important for us to create these images. It's important for us to make these specific statements, because at the end, I feel that the role of photography and the role of photographers is that we are the witnesses of the present time. And the one thing that I teach is that we're not only witnesses, but we are the archivists of that specific time in our history. So when you look at photojournalism across Africa, we have a lot of holes, because there weren't photographers on the ground that really documented these changing times and the changing history of the different countries. And this is really one of the reasons that, for me, when we talk about the advocacy component, it's not just about my work, but it's about really developing capacity on the ground and getting other photographers to learn the skills and to really enter into the international market, because through that perspective, then we have different views on one place. So it's not just my view, it's not just the foreign gaze, but the more photographers that we develop, then the more interesting sort of visual aesthetics that are coming through that. And then for the foreign audience, they understand, okay, Africa has many, many perspectives. There's, many ways to tell a history of a place. So as it relates to advocacy, my first commission actually that I did was with WaterAid and the H&M Foundation. And I remember when they came to me, this was really talking about water security and its impact on the development of society. And I told them, like, I'm not really, I've done a lot of NGO work, but I told them I wasn't really interested in doing the typical image of, the kid at the water well with the, pumping the water, or, somebody carrying a bucket of water. Like, I was interested in doing my own artistic interpretation through that. And often, people ask me like how I start the work, and everything I do actually starts on a piece of paper. So there's a lot of thought that goes into it. I write a lot, I sketch things out to just help me process. And through each work, it's also about the construction of the set. So for me, when we speak about, how do I come up with these images and what have you, everything that you see, it's the existence between an actual live location and also the creation of, a whole set. So in a way, I'm processing everything almost, my degree is actually in cinema and not photography. So I realized over time, what I'm really looking at is, how do I create my own universe? But within that universe, how do I tell a very specific story that is really something that's coming from what I have seen with my own eyes? So you have to remember, like, having traveled, throughout Ethiopia, and seeing also the different challenges of our women and what they go through in order to access water, this really became an influencing factor of, like, how do I construct each piece and what am I trying to say? And, one of the most common things in Africa is this yellow jerry can, and this is what you would see. So if you're driving on the highways, you just see this long line of women just carrying, this yellow jerry can, trying to, walking for, 2 to 3 hours just to get water back into the home. And every project that I have done and that I've been commissioned for, it's research is such an important component in photography. And this is one thing that I always say, is that you have to research everything, because through these experiences, I learn a lot of different things. And the one thing that I've learned really through this is that I never knew the correlation between access to water and the development of really how our women progressed forward. So for example, if you look back to this image, this was really talking about, menstruation. So for example, when young girls are menstruating, they're not able to go to the school because there's no access to water at the school. So they end up staying at home, and that has an impact on them being able to advance in their education. And if they're not able to advance in their education, then, it's basically just a vicious cycle that they go back and forth. So within this, there's a lot of symbols. So for example, the moon being there based on the cycle. And when you look at even this terrain, it's actually a real terrain. I shot this in the northeast part of Ethiopia called the Danakil Depression in the Afar region, which is the hottest place on earth. And to me, I wanted to also experience really what it meant to be in a place where there's no water. So here, for example, there's a small community that lives in this very harsh climate in order to because there's a lot of tourists that come there. And when I see that, it's, when you experience it on the actual location, I feel that it inspires the work in a different way. And so through that, my work really focuses on specific colors. I know people are always asking why these colors, and it comes back, and I say this before, it comes back to me not being comfortable with color. So I said, let me just focus on primary colors, because this is what I can process for myself. And a lot of the clothing, I do a lot of research looking at archive images of Ethiopia from turn of the century. And so I just basically get inspired by that. And then the face paintings is really a way for me to bring my country and Africa into the conversation. Because when you look at across Africa and the global South, the component of, face painting, body scarification, tattooing this is almost like in the tradition for me, it's a very contemporary act because in a sense, the community is using their body as a form of expression and as a form of really connecting with their identity and their culture. So through this approach, I really, I realized that, there is a way that you can make a bold statement and say the same things, because we're really living in a time where we have a lot of access to images. When you look at Instagram, you look at your phone, I think this is probably a moment in our history where we're consuming a lot, But within that, I think we become numb in a sense, because right now we look at all the wars happening, all, the different catastrophes and what have you, and that being pushed by the international media, at some point, I think the audience becomes desensitized. So for me, it's how do I use my visual aesthetics to bring the audience into the topic and also for them to be more curious. So when I was commissioned by the Nobel Peace Prize, this was the year for the World Food Program, which was looking at, how food is used as a tool for war. And I decided, okay, I'm gonna pick countries that I felt connected to and countries that I had actual experience in, or countries that I was curious about. So for example, for this, to me, was just a representation of Yemen. I spent part of my childhood in Sana'a. So thinking about where Sana'a is now and what I know of Sana'a, it's two different realities. And when we look at some of the challenges, especially that comes through war, a lot of it is really women and children are the ones that are impacted, heavily. So through that, all the different countries that I selected was really for me sort of to provoke sort of a different sense. So for example, in this image, this was for Namibia, and I didn't know that as it relates to Namibia, sort of the German influence that had happened as it relates to what happened to the Namibian people. Most people don't know this as part of history. And to me, it's, again, going into the research, I thought it was quite fascinating, and how, those that were against the Germans were basically sent out into the desert. And the only way, it's either they die in the desert or they come back and get killed. So I just imagine as a mother, just some of the thinking that comes about it, to either choose a quick death or a slow death. And I don't know if any of you have seen the landscape of Namibia. It's quite beautiful. You have this sort of desert landscape, and then you have the ocean, and then you see sort of these dried trees. So I try to incorporate that element within it. And then again, when you look at the clothing that the women are wearing, this actually comes from the traditional wear of the women, but I just reinterpreted it in my own way. And in actuality, everything we built, there's an actual canvas. So I work with artists, they paint for me my canvases. I have a large canvas of about 3 meter by 3 meter. And it's a way for me also, it gives me a reference point. And within Photoshop, we go in and we clean up the image. And I realized that when we build these sets, it gives a different aesthetics to how I see the image, but also at the same time, the audience also reads into it, something very specific. So, it's between the live location, between the live location and also building the sets. Again, it's just to try to maintain not only my aesthetics, but also my messaging. And within that, the color plays its part. And within that, it's also coded in a very specific way that for an Ethiopian, they will recognize very specific things in the work. I hope I'm not going too fast, and it's okay. So the next work that I did, this was for the End Fund. And again, I only work on projects that I'm curious about. I work on things that I feel passionate about and the things that I find to be relevant. So for example, during COVID time, there was a big issue in Africa that a lot of the funding that needed to go towards, neglected tropical disease was pulled out, and a lot of the funding went into COVID. And I found that to be very peculiar because COVID was not what was killing us. It was actually all these other diseases. And so when NFUND approached me again, and you have to remember, for all these commissions, everything that I present, it's a very precise approach. So what I sketch is normally what ends up coming out on the frame. there's only moments where what I sketch, sometimes we'll spend all this time of sketching, setting up, and what have you, and then I realize, oh my God, this is a horrible image. So we have to go back into restructuring it. So the way that I function is to keep things as organized as possible, and through that, it gives me an opportunity not to panic when I'm about ready to shoot, that it actually calms me down. And then all I'm doing for is really looking for that specific magic moment. And that's what really photography is about. It's about finding that magic moment. For me, I don't care if you're doing studio work, if you're on the streets, even if you're shooting food photography, it's always trying to find, that specific image that it says something to you. And also by that saying something to you, that it says something to the onlooker. So in this case, for the End Fund, what I focused on was really the human impact, because rarely when we talk about disease in Africa, it's a more of a scientific approach as opposed to really understanding the human implications of it. So in this image, for me, most of us that live in major cities in Africa, we see a lot of diseases that have been eradicated in the Western world, but are still on the streets. So when you look at elephantitis or you look at polio, all these things still exist. And as a community, living there, at some point you kind of turn a blind eye. You don't see these things, even though it's something that could be simply eradicated. So for me, it was just sort of a double meaning that we're turning a blind eye. But also when you look at diseases like river blindness, which just comes from a fly, which can be resolved with a pill, but it ends up becoming something much more severe. And a lot of that that I learned really was when we look at the culture within our continent, is that, and I thought this was super fascinating, is that we exist really between traditional medicine and Western medicine. So for example, in Africa, there's a heavy belief in our traditional medicines. And even for the scientists working in the continent, they have to really process that. And what ends up happening is you have to sort of have an understanding that traditional medicine is really for your spirit and the Western medicine is for your physical. And I didn't really process that. And through this project, again, these were the things that I learned and I realized, wow, this is super fascinating. So again, it was really to incorporate the traditional element or the spiritual aspect and to have a different conversation as it relates to, who we are as a people and how, um, I think for the Western world and for Europe to understand that we come from these heavy traditions and heavy culture, that it's not about, coming in and trying to save, it's to understand, what's actually on the ground and to try to understand who we are as a people first and also how we navigate through our communities. And most of it for me over the years that I've realized is that a lot of the challenges that we have in our continent, and especially when we look at health, it comes back to information and education. So this piece was really to speak about, without proper education and without proper dissemination of information, simple things like, for example, I remember we did a campaign on hand washing, why hand washing was important. For those living in Europe and in the West, hand washing is just an integral part of, just your day to day. But if you don't have access to clean water, if you don't understand how the things are transmitted, this all comes back to information. So, and that starts at the education level. So for example, most people don't know this, but when you look at certain campaigns, just by having a poster in these rural schools on specific diseases or specific issues has such a huge impact because it is actually the children that go back to their family and transmit that information over. So this is why I've been very big on education, because I've always felt that in order to change Africa, we really need to be part of education and reforming our education system. And through that, it's also understanding that the science aspect of it, and that's the thing, like within disease, there's a lot of doctors from Africa working intensively on this topic. It's not just outside doctors coming in, but through that, how do I express these things? How do I share this information? But then at the same time, how do I use the tool that I've been given in order to express something that has different levels within it, but also it's a way to provoke the international audience also to see, okay, we're not only telling stories through one form, but we're telling stories through different approaches. And I think currently where we stand, and even talking to different photographers from around the world, I understand that this is sort of the urgency for a lot of the young photographers. It's how to remain authentic, how to be able to tell a story that means something as it relates to this present time, and how do you have an influence for the future, and how do you change the future? So from my end, I exist between making my work, but also teaching and running a festival, because this is all part and parcel of how do we move the industry forward. And as Africans, how do we engage and enter the international market? And within that, how do we create our own authentic voice? And how do we maintain an aesthetic that's truly ours? And within that, how do we also navigate a very difficult market that, for the day-to-day, it has its own challenges within it. And to leave you off, somebody asked me what was a good photograph. This is what I believe in. And this is a statement from Irving Penn. So to me, again, we are in visual communication, regardless of what form that you're using. And visual communication for me means that whoever is looking on, did they get something from it? So for example, for me, the reason I make the work that I make, it's really, I don't believe in this excessive academia in photography. I think that if, whoever's looking at it, regardless of your location, regardless of your class, regardless of who you are, you have to be able to take something away. And that's when you know that you've done an effective job of, making someone think about what they just saw. And I think in our industry, and even when we look at the fine art world, sometimes it's above my head and I don't understand what the purpose of it is, but to me, it's not about creating work for, the galleries, or creating work for a specific level of class of people, but I think the role that we play is we need to address all the community and be able to create art that not only reflects us, but also engages the audience, regardless of who they are. And I believe that that is how being effective and, being a true artist is, being able to create connections with the onlooker within that. So that is my presentation, so thank you. Okay for time?
Thank you so much. I'm full of respect about your work, and I have, maybe I'm asking you first if you have any questions. So otherwise, I'm taking the first question. Oh no, Andreas, please.
Thanks. Hi, Aïda. Impressive work, really. When you see where you start and then where you move to now in the fine arts, I would like to know how much of your work, of each picture or some pictures, are photographed, and how much is later on Photoshop and work post-production on it.
So everything is photographed. So all the pieces are photographed, and then it's basically either creating a collage or a matter of cleaning things up. So for me, I remember in the beginning, we were photoshopping in backgrounds that was not photographed, and sort of the feeling of it was just not there, So all the objects that you see, or any strange placements or what have you, those are all images that have been taken, and then they're brought back in and basically laid out. And you have to understand, in this process, the sketch starts, then we go to the set, we shoot the set, and then when we go into editing, sometimes, for example, this image was not in the, I don't know if you can see it. Okay. So when you look at this image, this is not what I had envisioned. It just, during the shooting, I just couldn't find the image that I wanted. So I said, okay, let's shoot all the components. And so in actually the editing part, sometimes a whole other image comes about, and then that's when I realized, okay, this has been finalized, and then we can move on. But often, I think it's, I'm using Photoshop, as they say, it's like the salt in the stew, So it shouldn't be the whole thing, but I believe that every image, for example, technically we finish in the camera. So for example, my settings are always f11. This is always So the technical part, we have to have it down. And then the rest is just basically how we're compiling the image and how we're constructing it, and to keep myself sort of open, because you never know there's another layer of inspiration that comes in the editing process.
Thank you. I have a question because you were talking about your role as a teacher, as a festival leader, as an artist, and I think that's very impressive and also very important to bring all these pieces together to form also the younger generation. And my question is, what does the young generation, what are their questions or what are their targets? Can you tell us a little bit about their ideas or hopes?
No, I think for a lot of the young photographers, they're entering into a very difficult period in photography because there's more competition and there's less money, I believe. And I think one of the concerns is how to make work that actually means something, or how to make work that stands out, you know? And I believe that the market is shifting dramatically. And this is why, like, I think that when we talk about the role of photography, it has so many perspectives within it. So I remember there was a South African photographer who was doing commercial work, but then he existed within fine art world. And he felt so guilty for doing commercial work. And I told him why. Because for him, he felt that he wasn't being authentic. And I said, well, you have to pay your rent and, you know, you have to feed yourself. So until, you know, until you find a way to make the money within your fine art, there's nothing wrong with doing different styles of photography. But this, I feel, is the failure of our education system. And I think the market has moved quite dramatically, but the educational, excuse me, the educational component has not addressed, you know, this shifting aspect of it. And I think for a lot of the young photographers is to understand, you know, how do they promote themselves and how do they enter into the field. And I think, you know, having like financial literacy, understanding how to market yourself, these have to be really embedded within the educational component of how to make yourself competitive. And I think for a lot of the photographers, this is what they're trying to figure out. And even for a lot of the world competitions, sometimes there's a danger in that because then young people think, okay, this type of work won, so I need to submit this type of work. But it's not about that, you know. And this is why I think the power in the youth is there to really shift the market and shift the industry fully.
Any more questions here from the audience? I see Sebastian H. Schröder sitting there. He will be the moderator of our panel, and it's about artificial intelligence and the ethics of arts and photography. So what is your approach with artificial intelligence, or do you have one?
No, I mean, I think AI is a new contender in the market, and I think it's something that we have to accept. And again, it goes back to this Puritan idea of what is the image. And I remember, you know, the shift from analog to digital, there was a big issue with that. And now you have AI as well. But it means that, you know, we have to sort of navigate through that, because at the end, it's a form of an expression that we have to contend to. And, you know, the Pandora box has been opened. There's no closing it back in. And it means that, okay, now we have to address sort of how do we exist within all these different realms. And I think for AI, and I was even telling Sebastian, I mean, it's a revolution within the image industry, just as, you know, when you look at the printing press, you know, transitioning over, these are components that it's always moving the industry forward. But in the end, also, I think eventually there has to be a point of regulation. You know, if you're using AI as a form of fine art expression, I mean, we know when we see an AI image, but I believe that, you know, we're in a world, for example, where, you know, the vinyl record is something that's ancient and, you know, very old, but there's people still collecting vinyl records because they find a value within that. So I think we have to process this and we have to have a better understanding of it. The only danger for me is, you know, AI being used to duplicate sort of realities that don't exist. So I think that's the big issue. But as an art form, it's like, you know, we're just changing the paintbrush. You know, we're going through another approach. But in the end, it's going to become a thing of, you know, eventually when all this sort of big conversation is happening, at the end, it's going to be like, okay, is what created, does it mean something? Does it have any value in it? And you have to remember when the whole NFT hype came in, I remember in Africa, everybody was doing NFT. But in the end, it's like, if it doesn't have any value within it, and not financial value, but what are you trying to say with it? It ends up sort of fizzling out. So I know that there's a lot of different graphics guys in Africa that are doing AI. And again, it's just another form of expression. That's how I see it.
You also mentioned the need to regulate it. Okay, if there's another question.
Thank you so much for your presentation so far. I kind of want to circle back to what you said about like global South, global North relations kind of. And I'm kind of wondering if you have like an audience in mind when you create your images, like for who are you creating those images? Because I think that like people from the global South who have experienced things that you portray in your images can relate to the images. And for example, like if you're from the global North, for them, there needs to be some kind of explanation. So I'm wondering like how you go about that.
So, I mean, for me, when I create work, first I create it for myself, because there are things that I want to say and things that I don't want to keep inside of me that I need to put out there. So that's the first thing. The second, it's for my people. So, for example, Ethiopians will see specific things in the work, because even though I speak English like this, I'm still an Ethiopian, so the heritage part is not easy to remove. And the third, it's, I think as photographers and as artists, we should never be creating work for somebody else, because again, it comes back to your own truth and your own honesty. And when you start making work for other people, then it's not authentically, it's not the same statement that you're making. So to me, when I started out, it was really to address the misrepresentation of not only Ethiopia, but also looking at the African diaspora, how we are misrepresented in the international media. This is how I started. And it was just out of that urgency. So if you look back at my interviews from like 2009, I'm still on the same path and on the same mission. And I think for any artist, any photographer, you have to have that mission deeply embedded in what you want to do. And that's how you know that you're in it for the right reasons. So I'm very happy and very blessed to have reached these levels. But I didn't start off by thinking, okay, I'm going to be in the MoMA or in the, I didn't, that wasn't my intention. I just felt like I had something to say and I need to be able to share it to whoever is willing to look at the work. So as it relates to the aesthetics of the work, what I always say is that the color is a seduction, so I'm seducing you with the color in, but then when you go behind the color, there's a lot of things inside. And that's the whole thing, is just to, make people curious to just even do a basic Google search who don't know nothing about Africa or don't know nothing about Ethiopia, to just make a search. And then that's a way to, connect people globally. And this is also one of the main reasons I do, Addis Photo Fest and also Africa Photo Fair. I don't organize, an African festival, I organize an international festival, because I think for photographers from around the world, we have things that are in common than different. So how do we bring everybody together on the same page? Because at the end, we still have to deal with the system and we still have to deal with the market. And that means that if we're together, then we can actually move things forward, because the conversation is the same and it comes back to authenticity.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
Aïda, we are nearing us to the end. Can you give us a small spoiler? What's up next? What are you working on? Is there something? I think we can expect something something new and something which is really exciting.
First of all, I don't advertise what I'm doing next. No, no, I mean, the first priority for me is the Africa Photo Fair. So I'm launching that in the second edition in November 5th. But the next thing for me is basically coming back to the analog of this conversation that actually happens on the paper. So I've been testing that for a couple of years now. And that's the thing is, to try to come back to the analog, it's very challenging in Africa because we don't have facilities and what have you. But that's what I've launched a couple pieces here and there just to see how it looks and how the audience reacts. But when I started out in high school in Canada, I started actually in painting, and it's only because the teacher showed us the darkroom that when I made my first print, I knew, okay, photography is the language that I want to stay in. So in a sense, I think I'm a frustrated painter, and that's why you see all these colors. But if I could draw and paint, trust me, that would be the world that I would enter in. But now I'm at a stage where, like, and there's one thing I've said before, I've spent many years of learning the rules, and this is what I tell students, you learn the rules and then you break the rules in photography. So I think that's where we have to head towards, we have to master it in order to break it and have a different conversation. So in everything that I do, it's basically breaking every rule. And that's the way I think that I'm able to express exactly what I want to say.
I believe that you are a fantastic teacher. Learning the rules to break them is very important. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us. And we will have a little break now, and then we start with the panel at 3 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.